In this demo, we're going to go ahead and talk about setting up a Google Cloud SQL instance. As you can see, I'm currently in the GCP platform dashboard. What I'd like to do now is go over to the left side and select products and services. As you can see, we have the left pane up. Let's proceed down to Google Cloud SQL, which is actually right there. Go ahead and select that. As you can see, it says I have to create an instance. That's because I don't have any instances up and running. So what we'd like to do, of course, is to create a Cloud SQL instance. Let's proceed and select Create Instance. As you may be aware, Google Cloud SQL has two types of database engines. We have MySQL and we have PostSQL. Just be aware that MySQL that's supported is 5.6 and 5.7. And then PostSQL, which is still in beta, supports 9.6, version 9.6. We're going to go ahead and stick to MySQL. Let's select Next. It's also asking me, do I want to stick with the first generation or the second generation? Most customers are going to use the second generation. This is going to provide better support and will also provide better scalability, capacity management, as well as performance and high availability. With that said, let's go ahead and choose second generation. We are now on the generation instance page. What I'd like to do now is just create an instance ID. This instance ID basically is going to be an ID you'll want to name pretty judiciously, in the sense that you want to be able to identify it, but also realize once you create it, you're just not going to be able to rename it or anything down the road. Remember that Google Cloud SQL is a managed service. This is different in the sense that if you go and set up a VM and install SQL on top of that, you're essentially handling all the administration for that SQL instance. Google, on the other hand, is offering this managed service in the sense where it's going to reduce your administrative burden. One of the things to note too is that you don't have generally root access to your SQL instances, and that's something most DB administrators don't like to give up. However, when you do sign up for Cloud SQL, be aware that they're going to handle all the replication, they're going to handle the availability, they'll deal with backups. And your role as a traditional database administrator is going to be more focused on data usability, or perhaps data reliability, or whatever you're going to focus on. You're not going to have to focus on the day-to-day data administration tasks generally. So create an instance ID that generally would be, of course, easy to identify, usable later, but be aware you can't change it later. You don't have that capability. Let's name this instance something simple like test SQL 1. And that is a unique name because if it wasn't, it would let you know right away. For example, you could see that it doesn't allow IDs. And if I just do test, again, it lets me. But I'm just going to go test SQL 1 as we had done. Just be aware that the naming conventions are somewhat strict. You could use lowercase numbers and hyphens, but anything else like wildcards, you could forget it. You want to specify a root password. Again, you could, do whatever you so choose. I like to make sure that I don't have caps on. And I'll call it store 123. And it says if I select no password, again, it lets you know. In this case, I'm going to go store 123. And I have my caps lock on, as you can see. Let's take that off. And now store 123. And again, it's, this is your instance. You want to pay attention to how you handle your instance. Now, when it says root access, this is allowing you access to your instance specifically. This, the service, not the service per se, like Cloud SQL, but your instance running in essentially what's a container. From that perspective, just be aware that some of the capabilities with MySQL, you have to use the command line. In this case, we're just showing you how to set it up. Now, here's another area I want you to spend a little time on reviewing and understand the regions that are available and the zones that are available. If you select a region, you can see that there's different zones that are available. From an availability standpoint, you can configure essentially a failover replica if you so choose. Generally, too, you have to be aware that when you set up a replica, it will essentially be replicated to a different zone. For example, region US Central 1. What you could do is create another replica. Well, basically, you create a replica of this instance to another zone in that region. Again, that's your call to pay attention to that when you design your Cloud SQL service here. When we go configuration options, this is again a little bit, I guess I call it tricky. Not really tricky per se, that's hard to understand, but it could be tricky in making sure that you design this the way you want to design it. Again, Google manages all the infrastructure and all the backups, the patches and stuff, but you have the capability to either enable backups, enable HA. You could change the configuration of the machines that you're using. That's your call. You could also change the database versions. In this case here, we're going to run MySQL 5.7. We're just going to leave that the same. Now, this is sort of what I would call where the costs can really escalate if you're not sure what you're doing as far as scaling and sizing, I guess. So if we go up, I just want to make sure this is in the window. Okay. You can see that it says configure machine type and storage. Just be aware that if you do change any of this, that your costs certainly will scale as well. So if I go here to change, you could see that I could do a shared core, a standard machine by default is set. As you could see, when I change the left, this green changes. In other words, the throughput goes up as well as the cores and the vCPUs, you can see the memory. So that machine changes in size. I'm going to go ahead and leave that the same. Another area, the cost could be, another concern could be around SSDs. Now, SSDs, as you're aware, more than likely are, of course, much better performing, especially if it's coming around latency issues, around applications. Definitely having your database on SSDs has some real significant performance benefits. Now, this is the recommended config as well. If you choose HDD, you're going to have a cheaper cost, it says. But once again, that's a trade-off that I think you need to make ahead of time, just to make sure that you, If performance is what you want, go with SSD. If cost is really more of a concern, go with HDD. Storage capacity. Now, you'll notice that it says enable automatic storage increases. There was a time where this was actually not enabled and you had to enable this yourself. This is actually good because what was going on was some customers wouldn't enable that because it wasn't enabled by default. It's now enabled by default. If you don't want to enable automatic storage, then deselect it. Now, however, once you get above 10 gig, then you again could be running into some issues. If you don't have the space to write, you don't have the space to write. So pay attention to this setting. Disk throughput. Now, again, this will change if I go over here and I hit select. You could see that that changed slightly. But again, if I go here, you could see that if I change it to 100 gig, this will, of course, increase the number of IOPS, the disk throughput, etc. Let's go back and change my config to the default. And you can see that that changes significantly. Let me just show that again. Again, the best way to learn this is to play around. By changing the standard machine type, this will, of course, adjust the disk throughput and the IOPS. If I change to high memory, then you could see that that changes substantially as well. So do be, I guess, judicious in your configuration generosity. And I'll leave that enabled. And then I'll close that. And then I can go over here to enable backups. One of the things that Google does as a managed service is it does the backups for you. However, it also allows you to pick and choose when the service runs. So if you want to tell Google Cloud when the backups can run, it'll, of course, accommodate that. It'll also take care of what's point-in-time recovery as well. For example, what could be called like a redo log. High availability as well. You could go ahead and create a failover replica. And you could see that it'll name, this is test SQL 1 called failover. I'll go close. Authorized networks. By default, it'll place the SQL in the default network that you have. In this demo, though, we're not going to worry about a lot of this. I just want to show you how to get started and what options you definitely want to pay attention to. However, when you're designing this for production, you'll likely want to set this up in a specific network, like the specific VPN. That's up to you to decide. You'll need to pay attention to your subnetting, and again, your networking team, your cloud architects can help facilitate what makes sense. And if we go to database, now a database flag is essentially SQL syntaxes that you could set to perform specific actions. The best way to learn out to basically learn or identify what you want is go here to learn more. And you'll see that'll bring us over to the database flags. If you scroll down, it tells you what the supported flags are. The Cloud SQL flag is listed here, and what are the acceptable values, the type, for example, event scheduler. Do you want it on or off? For example, if you want to set the minimum or max words, for example, you could go ahead and do that, so on and so on. You can see that there is a fair number of flags to pay attention to. There are some things as well, some gotchas as I call them, that you need to pay attention to. Maintenance schedule. You could also identify a specific day and time you'd like to do maintenance on your instance. That's up to you to set. You could go ahead and do it any later, earlier. Again, I'm not sure why they named this like this. Basically, I would have, probably selected a specific time area or time zone / window, I guess, as it would be called, like, 10 a.m. to 2 a.m. or something. But if you go here, it tells you what that means. Like earlier is they'll update your instances before, other folks. It's sort of like the difference between getting it done at 6 a.m. versus 10 a.m. That's up to you to decide if that makes sense or not. And then add labels. You could also add labels. Labels will help you identify, monitor, etc. Let's go ahead and create. Now just double check here. US Central 1 is the region and the zone is 1A. Let's go ahead and create that instance. You can see that it's being created, and this will take a little bit more time because it's creating a failover instance. And you'll see when you go back to the SQL dashboard here, you'll see that it's still creating those instances. Now, like I said, this could take a few minutes, up to 10 minutes. So we'll come back to this when it's actually done. Now, this is still going. Like I said, it could take 10, 15. I've seen them take as long as 20 or 30 minutes, depending on the size and if you have a replica or not. One of the things I did want to show you is if you go over here, you'll see the notification area basically making some movements in pretty colors. Let's go ahead and select notification. You could see that it's basically saying that it's creating your instance. This could be useful too to let you know when it will be done as well. We'll go ahead and go back to this after it's done. Now you can see that the instance is done and it says that it is now runnable. You can see though that this is still in progress, the operation to essentially create a replica. Again, that could take a little bit more time. If I go to test SQL instance 1, you could see that it has a chart, a graph. It allows you to show different facets of areas you may want to monitor. For example, the number of queries that are being used. Ingress and egress bytes would be helpful. CPU utilization of the virtual machine. Operations that can happen as well. This tells you the IP address. You can copy to use Cloud Shell to connect to, for example, or you could go ahead and select the icon here. And if you go connect using Cloud Shell, this is actually a nice feature because this allows you to connect inside the Google Cloud. Whereas like if you're going to use the SDK, you're going to connect from your desktop. This is actually connecting you directly to the instance without having to go through the VPN or anything of that nature. So as you can see, I'm again connected here. It tells me, for example, G Cloud Beta connect. It's basically initializing that service. This will take a few minutes. We'll come back and check. And now you could see that it's requesting our password. In this case, we'll just go ahead and cancel out. We'll just feel free to play around with your instance if you so choose. What I did want to point out, though, is if you go over to the page where it says starting and stopping instances, just be aware that each of the instances are going to have a different process depending on the way you're managing it. So if you use the console or G Cloud, or if you have first generation or second generation. What is good is Google has essentially, if you see here, they tell you how you could stop the instance with gcloud, and you just basically click to copy it. If you want to restart an instance, same thing. Here is the command, cut and copy that, put in the instance name. Let's go back to the console here, and you can see that it's showing my storage usage. I just started it. It's about 1.37 gig, right? That's, good chunk of storage. What I want to point out is the pricing too. One of the things about pricing is you're charged every minute that this instance is running. The minimum amount, I believe, still is 0.015 per hour. What you want to do is go over to SQL pricing. So if we go over here, let's go to probably the best thing to do is go to product overview. And then scroll down. They usually have the pricing right here. Here it is. You can see that the pricing is here. Yeah, 0.0150 to almost $8 per hour. So that's your standard pricing. That's if you just spin it up. However, if you want to have what's called sustained use, that is where it's basically being utilized typically more than, I believe it's 50% of the month. That would fall into the sustained discounts. When it comes to sustained discounts, you need to, of course, look at the pricing guides, and each of the resources are a little different, like the VMs as well. So with the sustained discount, just be aware. Now, this is the pricing for Iowa. However, if you go to Sao Paulo, Brazil, you could see that the pricing is different there as well. South Carolina, so on and so on. So take some time to understand how the pricing works. Let's proceed back and let's talk about operations and logs. One of the things that you could do is tie this into basically monitoring products if you so choose. For example, you could go over here to monitoring where it says stack driver, select monitoring. And this will take a second. It'll go ahead and bring me over to my project. And you go over to resources. What it does is, by default, you could see that it's picking up my Google App Engine instances. I can also go over to resources. I could select Cloud SQL. And you could see that it picked up the 2 instances. And you could monitor Cloud SQL this way as well. And again, this is a new instance. You could see that it tells you everything is, available, the number of reads, the writes, the queries, network connections, CPU utilization, on and on. This is a very powerful tool. Stackdriver is probably one of my more favorite utilities in Google Cloud from a operations standpoint. With that said, you could see that SQL gets populated here as well on the dashboard. Now, the graph data may usually take, a few minutes to an hour, really. I've seen it sometimes too. The latency could be depending on where you're at, or could just be, what I have found, to be honest too, it could be a browser issue as well. I don't have a good answer because sometimes it's so sporadic. I may need to update my Chrome or something, but what should happen is that it'll load the graph. What you could do too as well is, let's just go to reload. So now let's go over to SQL, let that load or take its time. Go over to Cloud SQL again. And there it is. can see that I have the instances there. They're both available, runnable as it's called. I can then go over here and select that one. I could add labels. I could monitor it as well, as you can see. If I select the test app, you could see that if I select an hour. Now, that's storage use. If I go over here to CPU utilization, this may not be as up to date as what you get in Stackdriver. However, again, it could be just latency for whatever reason. I've seen it where Stackdriver is much more efficient than the console, so just be aware that this could be something you'll see. You can see that it's enabled high availability. I go over here to labels. I could create a clone. I could create a read replica. I could delete it as well. Let's proceed here. What I like to do now is let's just delete the instance, and you'll see that if I delete the instance, it's going to ask me to type in the instance ID. The reason that I want to delete it is because if I forget it, then it'll cost me some good money within a couple days, because again, you're having this run, and if it's not being utilized, it'll run up costs pretty quick. Or in my case, it'll make my little demo free trial run out really quickly. So let's go ahead and go delete. And you can see that it deleted the instance. It's pretty quick. And now we're back to the initial menu that we had when we first went over to Cloud SQL. That is how you create an instance and how you delete an instance. Let's proceed on to the next lesson.